My beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment. There are times when a story seems to find a person instead of the other way around. Perhaps this is one of those moments. Perhaps your heart has been carrying questions that no one else can hear. This is not a prophecy or a promise of future events. It is a fictional tale told through the voice of heaven, written to encourage hope, reflection, and faith. Last night, while the world slept beneath quiet skies and countless dreams drifted through restless minds, something unseen stirred in the silence. It was not a storm that shook mountains or a flash of light that turned night into day. It was softer than the wind that slips through forgotten windows. It was gentler than the first ray of dawn touching the horizon. Yet its impact reached farther than anyone could imagine. There is someone you love deeply. Their name does not need to be spoken, because your heart already knows who comes to mind. You have watched them carry burdens they never admitted. You have seen smiles that concealed exhaustion and laughter that hid questions too painful to ask aloud. More than once, you wished you could carry their pain yourself. Love often notices what words never reveal. That is why this story begins in the quiet hours of the night. Imagine a soul standing at the edge of weariness, wondering whether tomorrow could ever be different from yesterday. Imagine someone who had grown accustomed to surviving instead of truly living. They had convinced themselves that hope was dangerous because disappointment had become familiar. But heaven never measures a person by the weight of yesterday. Throughout history, the smallest moments have changed entire lives. A whisper has redirected kings. A quiet act of kindness has healed generations of bitterness. A single decision has transformed families forever. The greatest changes rarely announce themselves with thunder. They begin in silence. So it was in this story. As darkness covered the earth, the one you love entered a night unlike any other. Nothing around them appeared unusual. The room was still. The air was calm. Every ordinary detail remained exactly as it had been before. Yet something invisible had begun. Not around them. Within them. They did not understand it. They could not explain it. If someone had asked them the next morning, they might have simply said they felt different without knowing why. They might have dismissed it as a strange dream or an unexplainable feeling. But sometimes the deepest transformations begin long before they can be described. Perhaps you have experienced moments like that yourself. A sudden peace that arrived without explanation. A burden that quietly became lighter. A fear that no longer seemed as powerful as it had only hours before. Those moments often leave no evidence except the quiet change inside the heart. The person you love had spent so much time believing they were defined by every mistake they had ever made. Regret had become a familiar companion. Old memories repeated themselves like echoes through empty halls. They wondered whether anyone truly saw the version of themselves hidden beneath disappointment. In this story, heaven did. Not because they had earned it. Not because they were perfect. But because mercy has a language that reaches places shame cannot. If you could have seen what unfolded beyond ordinary sight, you would not have witnessed fear. You would have witnessed compassion. You would have seen light gently entering places long abandoned by hope. Not a blinding light, but one patient enough to wait until a wounded heart remembered how to look upward again. Transformation is rarely loud. It is often patient. It often arrives while no one is watching. And that is why so many people miss it. The person you love had unknowingly built walls around their heart. Each disappointment added another stone. Each betrayal strengthened another barrier. They believed those walls protected them. Instead, they imprisoned them. Every painful memory whispered the same lie: nothing will ever change. Yet lies cannot survive forever where truth patiently remains. As the hours of the night continued, something unexpected happened inside this fictional story. Memories they had carried like chains began to loosen. Questions they had never dared ask began finding quiet answers. Tears that had never been cried seemed to disappear into a compassion greater than words. No one else knew. No phone buzzed. No message arrived. No dramatic miracle interrupted the night. Yet everything was beginning to change. Real change often looks ordinary before it becomes extraordinary. Morning eventually arrived. The sunlight entered the room exactly as it always had. The birds sang exactly as they always did. Neighbors began their routines. Traffic moved. Life appeared completely unchanged. But appearances rarely tell the whole story. Something inside the one you love had shifted ever so slightly. Not enough for everyone else to notice. Just enough that heaven noticed. Sometimes a single degree changes the entire direction of a journey. They found themselves pausing before speaking harshly. They hesitated before believing another hopeless thought. They looked toward the future for one brief moment without immediately expecting disappointment. Small moments. Almost invisible. Yet every forest begins with a single seed. Every sunrise begins with one thin line of light across the horizon. Every healed heart begins with one quiet decision to believe that darkness will not have the final word. You may wonder why this story found you today. Perhaps because every heart needs the reminder that change is possible, even when it cannot yet be measured. Perhaps because someone you care about is fighting battles they have never described. Perhaps because hope often arrives disguised as an ordinary morning. Or perhaps simply because stories have a way of reminding us that grace can enter even the places we have given up on. Still, this is only the beginning. The one you love has no idea that the quiet change of last night is only the first ripple. There is another moment approaching, one that will test whether the fragile hope now awakening inside them can survive the truth that is about to be uncovered. When that moment arrives, neither you nor they will see it coming. And everything that seemed impossible may suddenly demand a choice. That choice is where this story truly begins. The morning unfolded like every other morning, and that was precisely why no one suspected that anything had changed. The world continued its rhythm without interruption. Clocks kept ticking. Conversations filled the air. Doors opened and closed. People hurried through familiar routines, unaware that the quietest moments often carry the greatest turning points. The one you love stepped into the day believing it would be ordinary. Yet there was a strange stillness within them, as though their heart had become sensitive to something it had ignored for years. They could not explain why certain words suddenly carried more weight or why familiar places felt slightly different. It was as if an invisible veil had begun to lift, revealing details that had always been there but had never been noticed. Sometimes change does not begin by adding something new. Sometimes it begins by helping us see what was always present. Throughout the day, small moments interrupted familiar habits. A memory surfaced without warning. A face from the past crossed their mind. A sentence someone spoke long ago suddenly returned with unexpected clarity. Pieces that once seemed unrelated began quietly fitting together. None of it felt dramatic. None of it demanded attention. Yet each moment gently whispered that the story was moving toward something impossible to ignore. There are seasons when heaven seems silent, not because nothing is happening, but because the deepest work happens beneath the surface. Just as roots grow unseen before branches reach toward the sky, the heart often changes long before the eyes recognize it. The one you love had spent years believing that every closed door meant abandonment. Every delay felt like rejection. Every unanswered prayer seemed like proof that no one was listening. But what if the silence had never been empty? What if it had been preparation? Those questions began echoing within them, growing louder with every passing hour. Meanwhile, beyond everything they could see, unseen threads were moving toward a meeting that no human mind could have planned. Lives that had traveled separate roads for years were slowly being drawn toward a single moment. Conversations that seemed insignificant would soon carry unexpected meaning. Decisions that appeared ordinary would reveal consequences no one imagined. Yet before any of that could happen, one hidden truth had to come into the light. The truth was not meant to shame them. It was meant to free them. Many people believe the greatest miracle is seeing impossible things happen around them. But sometimes the greatest miracle is discovering the lie that has quietly ruled the heart for years. That discovery was closer than they realized. As evening approached, an unusual peace settled over them again. It did not erase every fear. It did not answer every question. Instead, it gave them just enough courage to take the next step. Courage rarely arrives all at once. It often comes one breath at a time. One choice at a time. One quiet act of faith at a time. They found themselves stopping in the middle of an ordinary moment, overwhelmed by a feeling they could not explain. For a brief instant, they sensed that life was inviting them toward a different future, a future no longer controlled by old wounds. They almost ignored it. Almost. But something within urged them to keep listening. Far away, another person was wrestling with a decision of their own. Their path had been shaped by regret, silence, and missed opportunities. They carried words they wished they had spoken and apologies they had never found the courage to give. Neither of them knew that their stories were moving toward the same horizon. Timing often appears mysterious because people can only see one page while heaven sees the entire story. The hours passed. Night returned. The sky grew quiet once again. Then something happened. Not with thunder. Not with flashing light. Not with fear. A realization entered their heart so gently that they almost missed it. For the first time in a long time, they stopped blaming themselves for everything that had gone wrong. That single moment became the crack through which hope began pouring into places that had remained dark for years. Yet hope has an enemy. Whenever hope begins to rise, old fears often try one final time to reclaim their place. Memories returned. Doubts whispered. Questions resurfaced. What if nothing changes? What if this feeling disappears? What if I'm disappointed again? Those whispers were familiar. But this time, something was different. Instead of accepting every fearful thought as truth, they paused. That pause changed everything. Because in that pause, they discovered they had a choice. They could keep living inside yesterday. Or they could begin walking toward tomorrow. It was only the first step. But every extraordinary journey begins exactly that way. Even so, they had no idea that another revelation was already approaching. Someone connected to their past had begun carrying a burden that could no longer remain hidden. A conversation was drawing near. Words long buried were about to be spoken. Answers they had searched for in countless sleepless nights were closer than ever before. But answers often arrive together with decisions. And the decision waiting ahead would demand more courage than they had ever imagined. When that moment finally arrived, nothing in their life would look the same again. The question was no longer whether change had begun. The question was whether they would have the strength to embrace what was about to be revealed, because the next chapter would uncover the secret that had been hidden since the very beginning. The night carried an unusual calm, yet beneath its quiet surface, emotions long buried were beginning to rise. The one you love could no longer escape the questions that had followed them for so many years. Every attempt to silence them had only delayed the moment when truth would finally ask to be heard. For so long, they had believed that strength meant hiding every wound. They wore confidence where fear lived. They offered kindness while quietly carrying sorrow that no one else could see. The world praised their resilience, never realizing how exhausted they had become from pretending everything was fine. But no heart is meant to carry its burdens forever. As they stood alone in the stillness, a memory returned with remarkable clarity. It was not the memory itself that changed them, it was the new understanding that came with it. For the first time, they saw that one painful moment from years ago had shaped countless decisions that followed. It had convinced them they were unworthy of love, incapable of change, and destined to repeat the same disappointments. The realization was painful, yet strangely freeing. Sometimes the hardest truth is also the beginning of healing. They closed their eyes, took a slow breath, and admitted something they had never dared to say aloud: they were tired of living in fear. Tired of expecting the worst. Tired of believing that every good thing would eventually disappear. The admission did not solve every problem overnight. It did something quieter and perhaps even more powerful: it opened the door to hope. Far beyond what they could understand, other lives were moving toward the same turning point. Paths that had seemed completely unrelated were beginning to intersect. Small choices made by strangers, conversations that appeared ordinary, and moments that felt insignificant were becoming part of a much larger story. None of it happened by accident within this tale. Every chapter had been quietly leading here. As dawn approached once again, the first light touched the horizon. The air felt fresh, carrying the promise that every sunrise offers another chance to begin again. The one you love looked out toward the morning with a different heart than the one they had carried only days before. The circumstances around them had not changed much, but their perspective had. And sometimes that is where every lasting transformation begins. Still, one final mystery remained unanswered. There was a message they had not yet received. There was a conversation waiting at exactly the right time. There was a choice that would require courage, forgiveness, and faith unlike anything they had known before. When those pieces finally came together, they would discover that the events of that unforgettable night were never the end of the story. They were only the first step toward a future that neither they nor anyone around them could have imagined. And that future was closer than they realized. The days that followed did not rush forward with dramatic signs or impossible spectacles. Instead, they unfolded with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. Yet beneath every ordinary moment, something extraordinary was taking shape. The one you love began noticing things that had escaped their attention for years. Familiar voices sounded different. Small acts of kindness carried unexpected meaning. Even silence no longer felt empty. It became a place where reflection could finally breathe. There was still uncertainty. Questions had not disappeared. Some mornings began with confidence, while others reopened old fears. Healing, they discovered, was not a straight path. It moved forward one step at a time, often with pauses that felt frustrating but proved necessary. One afternoon, an unexpected encounter brought back memories they believed had been left behind forever. For a brief moment, they considered retreating into old habits. Building walls, hiding emotions, pretending everything was fine. But something within them had changed. Instead of running from the past, they chose to face it with honesty. The conversation was simple. No grand speeches. No miraculous revelations. Just two people speaking with a sincerity that had been missing for far too long. Some words were difficult to hear. Others brought relief. A few remained unanswered. Yet when the conversation ended, they realized they were carrying less weight than before. Forgiveness, they learned, does not always erase yesterday. Sometimes it simply loosens yesterday's grip on today. As evening arrived, they found themselves looking at the sky with quiet gratitude. Not because every problem had vanished, but because hope had returned where despair had once lived. The story, however, was far from over. There remained one final piece of the puzzle. Something hidden in plain sight from the very beginning. It was not a secret meant to frighten them, but a truth waiting for the right moment to be understood. Looking back, they began to see how moments that once appeared meaningless had gently shaped who they were becoming. Delays had taught patience. Loss had awakened compassion. Uncertainty had nurtured resilience. Even seasons of loneliness had prepared them to recognize genuine love when it finally appeared. The path had never been perfect. But it had never been without purpose. With that realization came a quiet determination. They would no longer allow fear to write the next chapter of their life. They would move forward with courage, even when every answer was not yet visible. And just as they embraced that decision, a message arrived, ordinary in appearance, yet carrying the power to change everything that followed. They paused before reading it. A deep breath filled the silence. Some choices divide life into before and after. They sensed, without fully understanding why, that this was one of those moments. As their eyes moved to the first line of the message, their heartbeat quickened, not because they knew what it would say, but because they felt that the journey that began on that unforgettable night was about to reveal its greatest lesson. What they read next would challenge everything they believed about loss, hope, and the quiet ways lives can be transformed. Their hands remained still for a long moment before they continued reading. The message was not filled with dramatic declarations or impossible promises. It carried something far more powerful: honesty. Every sentence invited reflection instead of certainty. Every word encouraged courage instead of fear. As they reached the final line, they realized that the greatest change had not happened around them. It had happened within them. For years, they had waited for life to become easier before allowing themselves to hope. Now they understood that hope is often the beginning of change, not its reward. The path ahead was still unknown. There would still be days when doubts returned. There would still be moments when old memories tried to convince them that nothing had truly changed. But those voices no longer held the same authority. They had discovered a quiet strength that could not be measured by circumstances alone. As the weeks passed, people close to them began noticing subtle differences. Their smile came more naturally. Their words carried greater patience. They listened more carefully. They no longer reacted to every disappointment with despair. No one could point to the exact day the transformation happened. It was the result of countless small choices made when no one else was watching. The one you love also began to notice something else. Opportunities that once seemed invisible were now appearing in unexpected places. New friendships formed through ordinary conversations. Old misunderstandings found room for reconciliation. Doors they had stopped knocking on slowly began to open, not because the world had suddenly become perfect, but because they were willing to walk forward with renewed confidence. Looking back at that unforgettable night, they finally understood why it felt so different. It was never about a single extraordinary event. It was about the moment they stopped allowing fear to define the rest of their story. That realization became the foundation for every step that followed. The future remained unwritten, and that was no longer something to fear. It became an invitation to grow, to forgive, to trust, and to keep moving forward even when every answer was not yet visible. There would be new challenges. There would be unexpected joys. There would be moments of uncertainty. But there would also be resilience born from experience and compassion shaped by every lesson they had learned along the way. As they stood at the threshold of a new chapter, they realized something beautiful. The person they had been was not forgotten, but neither did it have to define who they would become. Every ending had quietly prepared the way for a beginning. Every setback had become part of a greater story of perseverance. And every step taken with hope had brought them closer to the life they once believed was beyond their reach. The journey was not over. In many ways, it had only just begun.